Yes, I'm speaking on the subject of devolution from a purely Scottish perspective. I'm not as knowledgeable as maybe I should be about Northern Ireland or Wales and local legislative assemblies. But from a Scottish point of view, making three assumptions. One, that UKIP is a party that is completely opposed to the European Union. No nonsense. We can say in Northern Ireland, no surrender. We want to leave. We want to leave, and leave means leave. That's it. There's nothing to talk about. Just get out. Secondly, the UKIP strongly supports the union, not the nonsense of we might have the union a wee bit here and water it down. We support the union, and Northern Ireland is a fundamental part, as is Scotland, of the United Kingdom. And thirdly, that we have maybe a minimalist approach to government, that we, if I can quote the late Enoch Powell, governments only do those things which people must not or cannot do for themselves. We're not into the nanny state or anything like that. So we take these three things as a basis. Scotland historically has always had its own church, the Church of Scotland, however useful it might be, it's another matter. Had its own legal system, it's had its own education system, has its own sporting associations with two massive big football teams who compete regularly in European, well, one of them not so much recently, but regularly in European football. So we punch above our weight, and we are still, and always have been, an integral part of the United Kingdom. So it sort of basically makes you think, well, how did all this devolution nonsense start? And it probably, without getting into enormous detail, which would put everybody to sleep, but it probably started in 1967, when Winnie Ewing won the by-election in Hamilton, the town I work in. And all of a sudden, that was a sensational result because Labour's stronghold was suddenly going to the SNP. As tends to happen in those circumstances, panic sets in. Wilson, the Prime Minister, set up the Kilbrandon Commission. Edward Heath, the leader of the opposition, got in on the act the following year, 1968, the famous Declaration of Perth. So you now have a Labour Party and a Conservative Party committed, at least in theory, to some kind of devolution, although they didn't necessarily call it that. Then along comes the 1970 general election. SNP kind of slip, don't do so well. Naturally, the issue is forgotten. 4 years later, 1974, the year of the two general elections, the SNP gets 7 seats in February and 11 seats in October, and actually get 30% of the vote, 1 vote in 3 approximately. This sent the then minority Labour government into overdrive, and they introduced a devolution bill to try and this is the point, the whole purpose of devolution in Scotland is to stop Scottish nationalism. That's the point. It's nothing to do with whatever else it said. It's to stop, or supposed to stop, Scottish nationalism. And it led in 1979 to a referendum in Scotland, and there was a brilliant guy, long forgotten, a man called George Cunningham, who was a Scotsman from Dunfermline. He was the MP for Islington, of all places. He's a Labour MP, and during all the talk about this referendum, he said, in order for the referendum to win, to pass, it must be approved by 40% of the electorate in Scotland, not 40% of the vote, 40% of the electorate. And that was a tactical masterstroke because, of course, that was actually quite a difficult thing to do. And in 1979, the devolution referendum did vote yes, but only by a margin of 77,000, which obviously is not that much. And it didn't hit the 40% threshold, so it all collapsed. 1979, Mrs. Thatcher comes along, and for about the next 18 years, devolution is pretty well forgotten about. The SNP are not really very well organised, etc., etc., etc. Then along comes Mr. Blair, and 1997, he has it as his Labour Party manifesto to introduce another referendum, which we had in September 1997, and this time it was much more heavily in favour of devolution than it had been 20 years previously. But some of the old problems were never really addressed. There was another excellent Labour MP, now gone, Tam Dalyell, who said, how on earth, he was the MP for Linlithgow, and he's quite a left-wing sort of guy, but he was a very sensible bloke, and he said, well, how on earth can an MP in Scotland vote on issues relating to England, but an MP in England can't vote in relation to issues in Scotland? And you get this, so you have a devolved situation where a Scottish MP has a say in England, but an English MP doesn't have a say in Scotland. That was, Enoch Powell again called that the famous West Lothian question, and said arguably it has never to this day been properly resolved. Anyway, in 1999 the Scottish Parliament was established. Westminster's status remains unchanged. It is still the supreme lawmaking body, which if you listen to the Nicola Sturgeons of this world, you would imagine is not the case. Westminster is still the supreme lawmaking body. There are issues that are reserved issues, the obvious ones, thankfully, the defences, the national securities. I mean, the idea of the SNP having their hand in these things is too hideous to contemplate. But there are a lot of devolved issues which are maybe more practical day-to-day things, although they do have some control over taxation, and the least said about that, the better. So that's where we ended up. There's no doubt whatsoever that the Labour Party fully expected, and in fairness, not an unreasonable expectation, that they would win constantly in Scottish Parliament elections with the odd wee mistake here or there. They never for a moment thought the SNP would actually control the wretched place, and that's what we now have. And now we have all the various moves towards Indy Ref 2 and all the rest of it. So the consequences of all this disaster, and it is a disaster, is the Scotland Act 1998 called the local authority, and this is, as far as I know, the Welsh referred to their governing body as the Welsh Assembly. Usually the Northern Ireland one is related, it's just called Stormont. But in Scotland we call this dreadful phrase, the Scottish Government. This is utter nonsense. So we've got the Westminster Government, we've got the Scottish Government, maybe we should have Glasgow City Government, maybe Maastricht should have 14 Turnpike Road Government. It's utter nonsense, and nobody ever seems to challenge this garbage. So, and so much so that you actually have people talking about the governments. There is one government. It's the House of Commons. It's the Westminster government. And adding to the stupidity, yes, and sometimes you hear SNP people talk about the UK government as if they were talking about the French government or the German government, as if they were totally, they're over there and we're here. This is the kind of nonsense we've got. 2014, David Cameron introduced the Smith Commission, whose sole objective was to give more powers to the Scottish Parliament. A hideous prospect, if ever there was one. And naturally, English people, absolutely completely right, start saying, hang on a minute, you've got your Parliament, why don't we have ours? There is a political party, the English Democrats, with which we have quite a bit in common, and as I understand it, that's their fundamental objective. One of our former leaders, Paul Nuttall, made no secret of the fact that he wanted an English Parliament, which essentially would have been the House of Commons. So we end up with this nonsense, but that because Scotland has its own Parliament, the English must have their own Parliament, and we end up with we basically have a federal structure is the end result of that. Now, if that's what people want, fair enough, but I suspect it isn't. And that's all because people are pushing down the road of giving powers to the Scottish Parliament. You also have the regional assemblies in England, or even the London Assembly was established in 1998, so you've got Sadiq Khan for that. And Scottish MPs in the House of Commons, and again, I always come back to Powell, if you have, the great achievement of devolution is to take 72 Scottish MPs and make them 59. We now have 13 less than we used to have in the House of Commons. And you've got the hideous Barnett formula, which nobody really talks about very much, but is, however you dress it up, you can say it any way you like, is English money subsidising Scotland. There may be debates about how much and whether it should, but if the Barnett formula ceased to exist, Scotland, being a much smaller country and being a much more dependent on the state country, would certainly struggle. Right, so the final bit, therefore, is, having said all that, it's all very well to talk about the problem, what's the solution, or is there a solution? And that's why I think, I've argued this long enough. Stephen Daisley, who's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea all the time, but he he quoted from a panel-based poll that said that 19% of the people in Scotland would vote to get rid of the Scottish Parliament. That's almost 1 in 5. Needless to say, I actually have never met any, maybe I'm mixed, maybe I don't get out much, probably I don't, but I've never actually met anybody that likes the Scottish Parliament. I've never met them. There are always these people that, but 19% is an official figure. The Daily Mail, 30th of January 2018, said that the Scottish Parliament costs £100 million a year. The staff salaries are £25 million a year. You've got an army of people in the media, in the Scottish media, who love the Scottish Parliament, because if it's shut down, they've not got a job, which I understand. None of us want to lose our jobs. But it's unlikely that the Scottish media will be overly critical of the Scottish Parliament because they're cutting their own throats, so to speak. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, I've checked it as carefully as I can, but by my reckoning, her salary is 151,721. Theresa May, who's the Prime Minister of the whole, her salary is 150,402. So Sturgeon earns more than Theresa May. That's absurd. And again, you try and get that out there and nobody wants to talk about it. So basically what we have is a glorified form of local government. And there's obviously we're here for local government is essential. But let's call it local government. It's dealing with day-to-day issues that you don't expect the House of Commons to have a debate on a zebra crossing. Probably not. So local government deals with those things, school dinners, etc. You can have a debate about what they should deal with and what they shouldn't deal with. That's fine, but it's local government, and it is financed by central government. And UKIP should take the whole lot of this and put it in the nearest recycling receptacle. It's rubbish. It serves no function whatsoever. I accept that there's a debate about exactly what do you do put in its place. And we probably, even if we agreed on getting rid of devolution, wouldn't necessarily agree on what to do in place of it. But we could go back to a scenario where the Secretary of State from Scotland, who's basically a professional idiot as far as I'm concerned, was somebody who actually had a status in the cabinet, a Bruce Millen or a George Younger or people like that. They sat at the cabinet table. They mattered. They were important. And we had a Scottish Grand Committee. We got back up to 72 MPs. Some people think Scottish MPs should sit in Scotland rather than the House of Commons 2 or 3 days a week. All right, what's wrong with that? We can have various debates about how it's done, but let's get rid of the Scottish Parliament. It's useless. It serves no function whatsoever. And my last word on it, if we commit ourselves, well, I think we have committed ourselves to this policy, we are the only party who's doing that. The Scottish Parliament elections are not due to be held until 2021, which is a joke in itself, because they really should be held next year. That's a separate matter. They have a list system. We've got all kinds of strange people getting elected to the Scottish Parliament who I'm absolutely sure do not represent anybody, but they're very good at winning 6% of the votes, the Greens and people like that. All we need is roughly 5.6% of the vote on the second list. If we could ask the Scottish Unionists, who are absolutely useless, to come out every time there's a Scottish election, you never see them ever again. The Christian parties, again, they love sticking it. You end up with UKIP, Scottish Unionists, Christians, another Christian, one or two. We've all got, if we could get one guy into the Parliament in each region, we would have 5 or 6 MSPs. But we keep standing against one another. So I'm suggesting that UKIP go into the next, no nonsense about it. We want rid of the Scottish Parliament. I think we could get if 20% of the population don't like it, we even only get 1 vote in 4 of that. We're getting close to getting MSPs in each of the 8 regions that there is in the Scottish Parliament. So that's why I'm saying that. I don't think there should be anything, I can't see any serious argument about it, other than the fact that folks say, well, if 19% are in favour of it, 81% are against. But UKIP in Scotland will only appeal roughly to 1 voter in 5 anyway, because about 4 out of 5 vote for parties of the left. And if you include the Conservatives, it's even higher. So, you know, we only appeal to a smaller amount of people, but let's get there, let's scratch where they're itching. And who's to say? Time to shut up. So that's me, basically. So.